Welcome to part two of our special five-part series on unlocking success, the crucial role of culture in compliance best practices. Today we take up assessing culture.
This is Tom Fox, back for another episode in our special five-part series. Today I'm thrilled to have with me Victor Cooljack. Victor, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Tom. It's great to be here.
Victor, could you tell us your professional background and your current role?
Sure. So I'm, formerly the equivalent of a CPA, a chartered accountant. Originally, I thought I'd go get my finance degree and be a controller or a CFO, only to find out I really disliked financial reporting, but I did what was happening around audit and risk. And I ended up staying with the Big Four for about 10 years, gradually moving out of audit and more into an advisory risk consulting type role. Curiosity got the better of me, and I thought, let me see what life is like in the real world. And I ended up joining a Canadian publicly listed entity, or company rather, where I was responsible for the Canadian version of SOX, as well as heading up the enterprise risk management program there. And over time, I bumped into some colleagues, and that's where I am today. I ended up joining a software company where I found it was the best to blend the best of both worlds, kind of bring that strong sort of domain in risk and compliance, but add that cool, hip, really fun thing that a software company can add to the mix. And here I am at Diligent, being the Director of Customer Success and Services, where my role is really just to help our customers leverage our gear to the best ability they can in achieving their GRC, or their governance, risk and compliance objectives.
Victor, let me pick up on the word you used a couple of times, and that's risk. Professionally, my sense is that risk is something that your profession looks at. They may look at it a little differently than I do as a lawyer. Nevertheless, it's risk. And in the compliance realm, I think many compliance professionals, they certainly understand a risk assessment, but they may not be as comfortable with or aware of how you would take those same concepts and use that in a cultural assessment. So that's really where I wanted to start was, is there a way to think about culture as just a different risk?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say even an auditor, never mind a compliance professional, would get nervous when you attach sort of the word culture to risk, just because it's something that's intangible. It's something that's all around you. But if you were to ask someone, wake them up in the middle of the night and say, let's audit culture from either an audit or even a compliance point of view, a lot of people would be mortified and say, heck, where do I even begin? This is such a nebulous, weird concept. So yes, risk is basically anytime anything that can go wrong. What can go wrong? That's the question that you're trying to ask. And with culture, certainly there's a tremendous amount that can go wrong if you get culture wrong.
Are there some principles that you've either learned or actually practiced with in the arena of risk assessment that we could help a compliance officer think through the risk of culture, assessing culture, and maybe moving forward with that? How would you counsel or help a compliance officer understand those concepts?
Sure. So once you get over the initial shock of being asked to look at culture, if you take a moment and pause and look back, you'd see there's actually quite a lot of existing sort of guidance and frameworks that are available. COSO comes to mind, the King Code comes to mind, and oftentimes the logical starting point, as with anything to do with compliance or audit or risk, is to start to look at the tone at the top of an organization. What is the leadership saying and doing? How do they distill that into the tone at the top, the overall control environment, and going and diving deeper from that point of view? But that would probably be the place that I would start if I was asked to look at culture is, well, what is the top-down view? What is being said? And what are the actions that are being encouraged, discouraged, mandated, etc.?
I have to ask you about your reference to COSO. And I say that because of the following reason. I read the COSO internal controls framework in September of 2014. And when I finished with that, I said, this is the most brilliant thing I've ever read. This is about compliance. Who wrote this? Where did this come from? It's like I had my road to Damascus moment. the scales fell from my eyes and I saw internal controls for all things and became a huge fan of internal controls. But I heard you use the COSO framework, not really in a different way, but drove home to me the power of that framework, which was you talked about utilizing the COSO framework in a culture assessment. And so I wanted to ask you, as an auditor, as a chartered accountant, how do you see the COSO framework, and is it as powerful a tool as I think it is?
Yes, I'll answer that question in two ways. I'll tell you the best thing about the COSO framework, which is also coincidentally the worst thing about the COSO framework. And I think it's true of any sort of good framework is what's good about it is it gives you a lot of principles, and that's what gets you excited. It tells you a lot of the times what is the what that we should do or the what that we should have. But where I run into frustrations with it is it doesn't always tell you the how, and everybody wants to know the how. I know having the what is good. It gives you that sets the boundaries, it sets that sandbox that you should be in. So oftentimes you read it, and much like yourself, my reaction was, wow, this is great. It gives you a lot of sort of solid guidance, a lot of well-founded principles. But oftentimes that next step is what you're hoping to find and you don't always find. And I guess that's one of the natural drawbacks is something like that is good to have, but it can't be the be all and end all for what you're looking to do.
And you, the way you described it and other tools you mentioned as a way to think through the risk of culture, and you, I think, properly started with tone at the top and then moved to perhaps some rigor around written documentation, whether that be policies and procedures, whether it be a code of conduct, whether it be perhaps a statement of values. Do all of those sort of line up in a way that you could rigorously think through asking the questions to perform a culture assessment?
Yes, absolutely. And the reason for that is the tone at the top is really a starting point, but it's not enough. And it's you need other artifacts, you need other elements of that translate and filter down through your organization. And you touched on a couple of examples. Those are your policies, those are your procedures. So those are things like your code of conduct, employment practices and procedures, things that happen along those lines, how you interact with even vendors, and what whistleblowing practices you have along with that. The tone at the top is certainly the starting point, but you need other elements, and you need that to be available to all of your stakeholders that are involved when you're assessing cultures. That filters down. And then along with that, I would also go and look at what are the feedback mechanisms. It's great to have a policy and procedure, but if no one knows where they are, no one's bothered to read them, no one gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling. As an auditor or compliance professional, you're always looking for that warm, fuzzy feeling to know whether that risk is being addressed or mitigated or not. That's why you need some sort of way to check, is there a feedback mechanism? Is there a way that I know that people are looking at policies, they know how to find them, they know how to search for them, they even acknowledge that they've maybe read them or agreed to abide by them? Those are elements that you need to start considering when you're looking at culture, because that ultimately is a residual or a byproduct of your culture if you're able to answer those questions really well and have good evidence or good artifacts to back them up.
Victor, you mentioned, or I guess we both chuckled when we started this podcast, of when originally or initially faced with the task of auditing culture, many people go, how do you audit a soft, fuzzy, squishy thing like culture? But I just heard you name several specific strategies, tools, and techniques of the corporate world, which really either directly impact or even touch upon culture. And I'm going to pick up on the last one you gave, which was whether you call it a hotline, whether you call it speak up, whether you call it feedback, whatever it is, a mechanism that employees can communicate up the chain, have that information evaluated, and appropriate steps taken, whether it be a formal investigation, whether it be looking at a business process for potential improvement, or whether it be something else. And those are things, or I guess I should ask, when you sit down and explain to a CCO or someone who's trying to figure out how to assess culture, do they understand you're already doing culture's embedded in your code of conduct? Culture's embedded in your employment practices. No harassment, no retaliation, no discrimination. That's culture. Do the people understand when you start explaining to them, you're largely doing this? And so you've got policies and procedures and use the rigor to look at those issues.
So a lot of times people will come to you and say, we've got this policy, we've got this whistleblowing hotline mechanism, whatever it is. And they'll come to you and say, so does that mean our culture's okay? And the answer is sadly no. It's not a checklist exercise where you go through a list and you say, have you got this? Have you got that? Have you done this? Have you done that? It's actually a case where the sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And it's also around what you have to consider is once you have all that, are you actually cultures also about, are you actually showing what you're talking about or demonstrating your culture? You may have a whistleblower, to your point, a whistleblower mechanism, you've got the report. What was the end result of that? How was that communicated? Oftentimes, I'm not saying you have to give the whole details of this because it's confidential things that are maybe raised or disclosed, but it comes down to things like people forget, like if you're the unfortunate victim of a cybersecurity incident, how your culture also will come out in how you respond to that, how you communicate around that, how you resolve that. Those are elements where it's above and beyond just having certain elements in place and ticking the box and saying, yes, I have that. It's more, did your actions and did your communications and your overall response align with what you say your culture is or what you believe your culture is?
The end result of a culture assessment, as with a risk assessment, is that you get categories, a list, or topics of whether you call it risk, whether you call it culture, and that it gives you a mechanism which you can either force rank the risks, meaning we put a figure, an arbitrary figure around the biggest risk. Or if it's a culture, we take, once again, a forced ranking so that we have 1 through 5, 1 through 10, that we can then perform or utilize. There's some sort of gap analysis. Does that type of procedure that I've described that I would use from a risk assessment also work for a culture assessment?
Yes, I wouldn't see why not. And actually, I think it would be good if you look at the audience that you're dealing with, because they're probably everyone's in the risk management business, whether they realize it or not. And one of the ways you deal with risk is often it's not a static thing, and culture is no different. So ranking something or benchmarking it and having a basis to compare either to your previous assessment or your peers is actually very valuable and very useful and a good way of dealing with risk management, because you always want to know, today, am I better than I was yesterday, worse, or the same? How do I compare to my peers and things like that? So if you're able to translate something like a culture assessment into some sort of standardized way, the way you would assess any other risk, it helps because it gives people some commonality and some way to be able to respond or address any sort of risks that you're raising as a result of a culture assessment.
Victor, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted more information on any of the topics we've touched on, what might be the best place for them to go?
Shamelessly and selfishly, I would say please have a look at our website. It's Diligent. So the website is very simply www.diligent.com. And there'll be a load of information available there that will give you some more context and also refer you onwards to other information.
Well, Victor, I wanted to thank you again, and I hope our listeners will join us next time where we take up the culture management strategy. Victor, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me, and so do I.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Unlocking Success, the crucial role of culture in compliance best practices. I hope you'll join us for our next episode where we take up creating a risk management strategy for culture based upon your culture assessment. This special 5-part podcast series is sponsored by Diligent, and I hope you will check out Diligent if you have any questions on these matters. This is Tom Fox. Thanks so much for listening. We look forward to visiting with you again.